So, thank you for joining us for this introduction to science policy at the Geological Society. My name is Dr. Megan O'Donnell. I'm the Head of Policy and Communications here at the Geological Society, and I'm really happy that you could join us for what is our first ever event of this kind. The idea of the day is to give you a bit of an indication of the types of work that we do in the policy team, run you through some examples of the way that we do this work, and then a little bit later on, we're going to also do a workshop which will help you to consider your policy position, consider the opportunities that you may have to engage with science policy, and also to, I guess, frame the context that you're trying to engage with policy and answer some questions about how you might best go about doing that, to give you some action to take away if that's something you wish to do. And if you don't wish to, then it's a nice chance to reflect on maybe why you're here and what brought you here in the first place. So thanks for coming. Just a quick matter of housekeeping, there shouldn't be any fire alarms. So if we do hear one, there are fire exits at the back of the lecture theatre and also one behind the blue curtain. The muster point is across the courtyard outside the Royal Astronomical Society. If you meet there, then a fire warden will tell you what to do next. I'm not expecting any drills or anything today. So if you do hear something, please leave. Today's agenda will look something like an hour of presentation from myself and my colleague Katie, who you'll meet in a second, about science policy at the JOSOC. We're going to have lots of time for questions, if anybody has any burning questions or things they've always wanted to ask us. And then we'll have a break where you can go out and grab a coffee, grab a tea, meet each other, chat a bit more about the stuff that you've heard this morning or about each other's expertise and share and learn. And then we're going to do a workshop a little bit later on for about an hour, which will be in the library. Well, we'll do a presentation in here and then sort of team-based exercise outside with pens and paper. We're going to go back to school. Which will help you reflect on that policy position that I was talking about and policy aims that I was talking about earlier. We'll close by 12:30 at the latest, in case anybody has anywhere else to be. And we hope you can join us for the workshop, but if you can only join us for the beginning of today, I also completely understand they do stand alone. So worth bearing that in mind. So it probably makes sense to tell you a little bit about myself and my background and how I ended up here at the JOSOC working in science policy. So as I said, my name's Megan. I've been working at the JOSOC for almost 5 years now. My background is in geology, and I originally did a geology degree at the University of St Andrews, where I had a particular interest in geoscience as it relates to society. So all parts of geoscience as they related to things that people who weren't geoscientists cared about. And I think that's where the sort of science policy niggle for me started to develop. I did projects in carbon capture and groundwater management and policy relevant geology topics that at the time I didn't realize were policy relevant. I just was interested in them because it's what my peers or people outside of the subject were interested in. I then worked in the education and outreach space. I worked developing education modules for school kids in those policy relevant topics to teach them about how they might go into careers that had a policy relevance. And again, I didn't really realize at the time that this was all science policy. It was all just geology that had some kind of relevance to people. I then went and did a PhD at the University of Edinburgh, and that's where I guess the science policy side of my career really got cemented. I looked at the geochemistry of wastewater that was produced when you fracked different wells and modelled the change in geochemistry of the water based on the geochemistry of the rocks. And there was a huge amount of political interest, for obvious reasons, in that research. And that political interest from government bodies, also politicians themselves, and teams working in policy was really the thing that kind of, I would say, skyrocketed me into the policy space sooner than I had imagined. I really enjoyed working in that space, and I really enjoyed communicating the relevance of geoscience to people that might need support doing so. So when an opportunity to join the JOSOC came up, as a policy intern back in 2019, I took that, and I've been here working in policy ever since. So I don't do this work alone. I do it with lots and lots of different collaborators, but we also have a policy team. The policy team is made up of myself and my colleague Katie, who's going to come up and tell you a little bit about herself and how she ended up in science policy now. Thanks, Mel.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. As Megan said, my name is Katie Jones. I'm Policy and Communications Officer here at the Geological Society. My background is as a physical geographer, where I studied at the University of Manchester. I looked specifically at research into paleoclimate and glacial extent across central Wales. I then graduated and worked for a few years before then returning to education, where I did my master's in climate science and policy at King's College London. I then worked as in a sort of similar role as research and policy officer in an organisation that promoted evidence-based policy making. I then wanted to return to sort of utilise my degree, so I ended up at the Geological Society, and it's been great. So I'm really excited to be able to share with you guys all the sort of exciting work we've been doing.
So Katie and I are going to do a bit of a double act for this presentation. We're going to switch back and forward and tell you about, I guess, our favourite, but some of our recent examples of our work a bit later on. But to kick off, I'm not sure how necessary this would be. I thought it important, seeing as we're here, and I wasn't sure who was going to be here, to tell you about the Geological Society. I'm sure that all of you know who the Geological Society are, but just in case you don't, Katie and I do this Science for Policy work on behalf of the Geological Society, and the society where we are now is the UK's National Forum for Geoscience. We represent around 12,000 members in the UK and worldwide, and we have 3 core aims. These 3 core aims overlap almost identically to our policy aims, and they are to improve knowledge and understanding of the Earth. It's critical and fundamental that we do policy work to contribute to this aim. To promote our science education and awareness, so we also work in the education policy space to promote and support and advocate for geoscience education, and to promote professional excellence and ethical standards in the work of earth science and earth scientists for the public good. Our policy work also spans this because we represent our members in areas such as EDIA policy, culture and workplace policy, research funding policy, and higher education policy as well. So that's a little bit about the GeoSoc. Science for policy, however, some people may know a little less about, and hopefully that's why you're here today, to learn a little bit more. It's the process, so science for policy is the process by which information is transferred or exchanged from the scientific community as the custodians of that information to a policymaker with the intention to produce or support evidence-informed policy. Now, our policy work specifically aims to communicate technical geoscience information as and where it relates to any public policy topic. This is to make sure that geoscience considerations are made aware of in public policy-making processes, but also to seek out and maintain relationships with organisations that do the same thing in the UK and around the world. So to make sure that this is happening not just where we're based, but also wherever it's possible to make it happen. Our core policy work and some of the things that we're going to be telling you about today through our examples consists of 4 key kind of pillars. The first is communicating geological information to support evidence-based policy making. The second is communicating the value and importance of geoscientific knowledge. Now, this sometimes sounds like the same thing as point 1, but the difference is that this is about the value of the community's knowledge, the people themselves, and the value of the sort of collective awareness that geoscience brings to society, as opposed to specific technical and scientific evidence in policymaking. The third is supporting our fellows, members, and, to be honest, the wider geoscience community in communicating their expertise and engaging with policy where they can, and also in hosting and attending policy relevant meetings to foster relationships and connect stakeholders in the policy space. So science policy means different things to different people, and I thought it would help or make sense to set out what science policy means to us at the Geological Society and where the majority of our work sits on the science policy kind of extremity scale, if you like. When some people think of policy, they think of politics, and when some people think of policy, they maybe think of activism and protesting or lobbying, and I thought it would be helpful to set out the difference between some of these types of science policy or policy engagement or political engagement generally, to set the context for some of the examples we're going to give later today. So the majority of the Geological Society's policy activity happens in the space on the left-hand side of this slide, which is in the advice column. Advice aims to provide policymakers with information that is technical or complex or inaccessible to them in a format that they can use to support decision-making. It doesn't try to change that decision-making. It doesn't try to alter or infer things about that decision-making, and it doesn't take into account values or identities that might be at play in the policymaking. So the beneficiary is not necessarily part of the advice equation. This type of engaging with science policy involves a really critical understanding of the science policy context and landscape, and understanding how the evidence that you're supplying in the form of advice relates to the policy issue at hand, and being able to synthesize information, analyze it in a way that a policymaker needs, and deliver it in a timely manner in a language that is suitable to their level of understanding and a format that actually can be used by them. All of these things are skills that form part of working in science for policy, and they're part of the skills that we'll explore in the workshop later on, is a sort of suite of skills that you might need to engage in science policy. The next step up, if you like, in the science policy kind of ladder, if we're going from sort of advice towards activism, is advocacy. Advocacy is science policy activity that aims to influence a group, whether that be political or otherwise, with advice that has a sort of a policy aim or an impact in mind. So this could be engaging with the public with a view to changing minds or hearts. This could be expressing an organizational opinion on political decisions, such as a funding decision or change in policy, or supporting others to engage in policymaking. They're all forms of advocacy. And while the work that the Geological Society does in science policy mostly sits in the advice side, sometimes when the impact of that work sits firmly within the Geological Society's remit, we will advocate for something. A really good example of this is expressing an organizational opinion on political decisions. So when funding decisions are made by government that affect our community, or where policy decisions are made that also affect people who are our members or the geoscience community, we could, and sometimes do, take political opinions on those things and make them public. Another great example of where we advocate for things is in the geoscience education space, where we will comfortably advocate for the support and continuance and furtherance of geoscience education. It's another good example to sort of take us on the next rung on the ladder into lobbying, which is a sort of subset of advocacy, which the Geological Society don't tend to do. It's an act of trying to deliberately influence decisions of policymakers with a view to changing something or achieving a certain aim. A good example of the difference between advocacy and lobbying would be taking that support for geoscience education that I mentioned and turning that into a request on government to increase the provision of A-level in schools, geology A-level, that would be. We don't tend to lobby government because sitting in the advice column and occupying that space requires us to act as a trusted partner. And as soon as you tick over or go up the ladder into sort of lobbying or towards activism, you occupy a different space in the policy landscape where you can no longer hold an impartial space of trust. You can no longer deliver science evidence on behalf of your community impartially and in a trustworthy manner. So as you move through these rungs, you change your political position. And that's another thing we're going to explore a little bit in our workshop later, is the sort of advantages and disadvantages of moving through these rungs of the science policy engagement kind of ladder, if you like. It's a weird metaphor I've chosen and I'm sticking with it. And how they can benefit and challenge what you can achieve in the science policy space. The final column here on the right-hand side is activism. And that's something that as an organization, we absolutely do not do. And that's for the same reasons as I've mentioned before. However, scientists and researchers advocating for specific causes or policy changes through activism is something that is necessary, it's right, and it's something that we don't expect our members not to do. So the differentiation between the organisation not doing it and individuals not doing it is quite important. Activism is necessary in many political landscapes. It's a really important tool, and it can be used in collaboration with science in really exceptional ways to create change that is beneficial for both scientific communities and the science itself. We won't talk about activism much today because it's not really within the remit of the society, but I have loads of resources about science activism if anybody wants to contact us to talk about science activism later or separately. It's a fascinating topic that we can definitely support people on learning more about. So that's a lot of the background of science policy theory. I didn't expect this to be a lecture, but it sort of sometimes turns into one because I wasn't quite sure what people would already know about science policy and where they would be coming from. But from now on, hopefully, we'll be talking more specifically about the science policy work that the Geological Society does, why we do it, how we do it, and some examples of that work itself. So policy for science is very confusingly the opposite of science for policy. And I think it's important to talk about that aspect of the work that we do as well, because it's not the focus of what we're going to go through today and what we're going to introduce people to today. We've got a focus on the science side, but the Society, as I mentioned, also does a huge volume of work in policy for science, which is the policies and practices that affect our community. So this can be topics such as funding, education, culture, migration policy, economic growth and development, regulation, licensing, things that affect people and culture more than sort of science and policies around technologies or industries. We do the majority of this work through partners. So we partner with the Campaign for Science and Engineering and also the Science Council, who are two membership bodies who have policy teams specifically designed to conduct this work for us. And in this green box here, I've highlighted some of the goals of their recent campaigns or their sort of policy asks or policy goals, basically. So one example or a couple of examples are that science holds the solutions to societal problems. So these organizations work on our behalf to implement that idea in government and make sure that government kind of are aware that that is a fact that holds to be true. It sounds kind of crazy when you say it out loud that you have to do that, but these organizations work very hard to make sure that successive policymakers and politicians know and remember some of these things, including science can be good for the economy, for example. A good example of work that we did with the Campaign for Science and Engineering to prove this is to investigate the economic impact of investment in research and development, where we worked out that I think it's £1 of investment equates to £25 back over a certain time frame. And research like that is the evidence that these organizations use to inform government of the benefits of promoting and supporting science and science culture. So I've got a few other examples of the policy for science work that we do. One of them, one recent, not that we do, but that our partners do indirectly to support the geoscience community. A recent one is the Campaign for Science and Engineering's campaign to promote the opportunity for science skills in the UK. So they did a huge amount of research and prepared a report about innovation and the economic impact of science innovation in the UK. And these reports that are written sort of on behalf of the member organisations are then available for these organisations to use and promote within government, to have conversations about skills gaps, for example, a really important policy point for geoscience at the moment. The ability to attract, retain and promote international talent and collaboration, and also to incentivize employers to promote skills and talent at a regional or local level. One major advantage of collaborating through these umbrella organizations, such as the Campaign for Science and Engineering and also the Science Council, is that our voice is much stronger on these topics when combined with lots of other science organizations. So when we are a member of a body that brings together lots of different organizations on a topic that relates equally to all of them, for example, science funding affects almost every scientist in the research space equally, we are able to grab the attention of policymakers a lot more easily. And that's another theme that we'll explore in our workshop later when considering your policy position and how you can use people around you to your advantage when engaging in policy. Using our kind of sibling societies and other science organizations is a great way that we as an organization do this. Another really confusing slide title from me, but this is an example of when policy for science work overlaps science for policy through the Science Council, who we're a member of. The Science Council have begun hosting annual policy showcase events, where through bringing lots of different science organizations together on a particular cross-cutting topic, they showcase the importance or the value or the opportunity within certain policy issues to policy stakeholders, particularly policymakers, government departments, and people working across the science policy space in other organizations. So in 2022, we did a conference on climate where we collaborated with physicists, chemists, engineers, Institute of Environmental Scientists, food scientists, nutritionists, biologists, if I didn't already say biologists, ecologists, and brought everybody together to kind of form a united front and communicate to policymakers where the opportunities to really use cross-cutting science were to solve some of these big problems, such as climate. However, we are in the Geological Society, and I am a science policy person, but policy is not all about science. And in most cases, it's not at all about science. And so trying to include science in the policymaking process is an uphill struggle. And that's for good reason, because there are many factors that influence a political decision that have nothing to do with science whatsoever. And you know, engaging politicians in science and science evidence doesn't exist in a vacuum. So it's a practice where empathy and considering the wider context of the work that you're doing is incredibly important. I've put this little circle up here that sort of indicates or hints at the policy process, that sort of suggests that you go around in a nice circle and just consider all of these things in turn. And in reality, forming policies is nothing like this. It's sort of more like a snakes and ladders of considering one of these things and then remembering something else and then going off in this direction and coming back down another snake. I'm really into ladders today, obviously. And evidence is not just science. So evidence means lots and lots and lots of different types of evidence. Science just a subset of that kind of evidence. So policymakers use lots of different forms of evidence, from anecdotes to conversations to media to social media, to make the decisions about how they make policies. And I think it's really important to remember, especially as scientists or as someone who represents scientists, that it's just one tiny piece of a much bigger puzzle. And politicians quite often have to make decisions, not necessarily between a good option and a bad option, but between lots of good options. And it's not science's job to determine which of those options are better than the others. I think it's important to remember. Another thing that I think can sometimes be forgotten is, or maybe it's very obvious, is that people working in science or scientists are not politicians and vice versa. Few politicians are scientists. Very few in the UK have a science background. I can't remember last time I checked these numbers, but last time I did check, which was maybe 6 months ago, 4 of the members of Parliament in the House of Commons had a science background, which is an astonishingly low percentage. So there's a really, really low level of science literacy in high-level government in the UK. And the priorities of politicians are very different to those working in science. So in this context, I'll assume that a scientist is a researcher, although I'm well aware that a scientist can be lots more things than a researcher. But these 4 things are really good examples of where the sort of approach of a scientist and a politician differs really widely. So time is the first one. Policy moves at a pace that completely outstrips scientific research, where you might work on a scientific paper for years, sometimes tens of years, and you might work with teams of from 2 to 20 to hundreds globally. Policy works in a much shorter time frame, and the frustration that both sides feel that the they can't be on each other's timeframes is incredibly difficult. I think COVID is a really good example of where policy outstripped science again and again and again, because politicians were expecting answers to be able to just be produced if enough money was fed to the right department. But anybody that's worked in a lab knows that you can't hurry an experiment. And so the incentives to engage across the pond, if you like, are quite low because, well, they don't work to my time frame and they don't work to my time frame, so why bother? Because they don't respect me or they don't understand. And so that theme of empathy, connection, and understanding is something we'll also explore in our workshop later on. Attention span, similarly to time, researchers, for very good reason, like attention to detail. They like to include lots of detail. They like to include citations and references and data tables and appendices that go on for eons. I've never met a politician that's ever looked at an appendix, ever. I've never met a policy maker who's ever really done anything but rip them off the back of the paper and kind of throw it away and get on with the main bit. They're incredibly time poor and they're making decisions on the first 6 sentences they read from the document that you produce. And so you might have seen that big important scientific documents like the IPCC reports now have summaries for policymakers. I've heard feedback that they're still too long, and they are 2 pages. That's hundreds of pages of a report summarized into the shortest possible thing, and it's still not good enough. And that is something that's never going to be squared. You're never going to be able to create more space for a politician to review evidence, and you're never going to be able to fit science into the policy timeframe. So finding ways to alleviate the strain between those 2 different timeframes is really important when you're trying to bridge the gap between science and policy. Definitions. Definitions is actually more of like a sort of scientists and everyone else point, but it's particularly important when it comes to communicating in a quick time frame with people who are going to take what you said and then communicate it on behalf of someone else, which might be a sort of policymaking staff member, for example. Short-term and long-term to a geologist means something very different to the entire rest of the world. And so being really specific whilst not being so wordy is one of the great challenges of communicating what the actual content of the scientific research is to a policymaker without making it all just numbers and empirical. And the final is uncertainty, which again, I think is particularly pertinent for anybody working in geoscience. Scientists tend to treat uncertainty as an inevitability. They're used to working with it, they're comfortable working with it, and they're comfortable assessing its impact on the outcomes of a piece of research and communicating those. Whereas policymakers aim to remove uncertainty completely, whether that is possible or not. They want to communicate strongly, clearly, and confidently with their electorate or with whoever they're working with that there is no uncertainty in the decision that they've made. And those 2 things are never likely to change either. So some of these are examples of the differences between ways of working that you're kind of up against when you're trying to cross the divide between scientists and policymakers. And people like Katie and I that work at the nexus between the 2, it's our job to try and make all of those little joints move a little bit easier and simplify these things. So, how do we actually do all of this stuff that I've made sound really, really hard? Well, it's not as difficult as it might seem. And actually, there's a bit of a formula around it. And now, Katie and I are going to go through examples of each of the sort of 4 pillars I talked about of the work that we do, and explain using examples how we do some of those things. So the first one, the first key way that we do science policy work is communicating geological information as and when it responds to policy concerns. And we do this by responding to parliamentary inquiries from House of Commons and House of Lords select committees. They're groups of people in the House of Commons and Lords who have collected themselves around topics that are of interest to them. So we predominantly engage with the science and technology select committees, but often and more frequently now, there are more committees getting involved in non-science work for example, geopolitical reasons. So the Foreign Affairs Select Committee recently had an inquiry into the geopolitical impacts of critical mineral exchange around the world. And that's a great example of when something geological and requiring geological input and expertise might be happening outside of the traditional science and technology space in policymaking. We also respond to government consultations launched by specific departments. So recently, it's been departments such as DSIT, so Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, and also DESNES, catchy, the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. But we've also worked with the Department for Food and Rural Affairs, Department for Environment, Department for Education, and basically whoever's interested. And we choose how to respond to these consultations and inquiries on a case-by-case basis. We don't have the ability to respond to everything that comes up, but one of the primary ways that we find out that these things are happening is through connections in these departments, but also through our membership. So quite often someone will contact Katie or I with a consultation that they think the society should be involved in. And that's a really great way that as individuals, you can contribute to the work of the society by making us aware of important policy topics or points that you think that we should know about. That allows us to make a decision about whether we can respond and whether we have the expertise available and also the remit to do so. I'm not going to talk through an example. I'm just going to move on to the next thing. Another way that we do this is our policy work is communicating the importance of geoscience knowledge. So this is a bit less about specific technical expertise and more about kind of brand building and raising awareness of geoscientific information in policy considerations. So you might have noticed when you came in today that on the table out there, there's some documents. Please feel free to take as many of those away. They're copies for you to take away. They're examples of some of our recent policy briefs that we produce, where we analyze, collate, and summarize geoscientific information on policy relevant topics, and then try and make sure that those briefings are in the hands of policymakers working in those fields. So a few examples that we worked on recently are decarbonising heat with geothermal energy. This policy brief looked at the opportunity to reduce fuel poverty in areas where mine heat could be used for space heating systems in the UK. And another is geoscience and the hydrogen economy. So hydrogen has been touted as a sort of clean, green alternative fuel, but there's huge capacity to store hydrogen in geological reservoirs. And so one of the things that this note looked at is all of the different types of geology that the UK has and where we might be able to support a hydrogen economy through geological storage. All of these are at a really high level. So if you have no background in the subject, ideally no background in geology, you should be able to pick one up and read it and understand it. And we're working on one at the moment all about how carbon capture and storage will contribute to our ability to achieve international climate goals, specifically within the UK. I'm going to hand over now to Katie, who's going to tell you about her recent involvement in the last two parts of how we do our work and some of her favourite recent projects.
Hi. So as Megan said, I'm going to start by focusing more on specific examples of our policy work using two case studies to demonstrate the breadth. I'm going to start by looking at Voice of the Future and then move on to our work across the devolved nations. So Voice of the Future is a yearly event organised by the Royal Society of Biology, which we've attended for several years, but this was my first year in attendance. The event is an opportunity for young people who are interested in science and politics to engage with MPs and ministers about topics that matter most to them. It often sort of covers subjects across science, technology, engineering, and maths. So Voice of the Future is important because it provides an opportunity for students and early career scientists to ask questions directly to members of parliament and ministers, as well as government officials about science policy and the role of science in society. It mimics the form of a reversed parliamentary select committee, which, if you don't already know, brings together groups of cross-party MPs to scrutinise the government's work on specific topics. This year, early career representatives posed questions to a variety of panelists, including the chair of the Environmental Audit Committee, Philip Dunn. Specifically for us, it gives us a really unique opportunity to highlight the contributions that geology makes in developing modern public policy. So prior to the event, we put out a call to volunteers to submit their geoscience related questions. Once we select a representative, we submit their question plus 2 of our own to the Royal Society of Biology, who then decide which one, if any, will be selected to be asked on the day. We obviously want a question of ours to be selected, so we use our understanding of the policy landscape and our sort of knowledge of the background of event attendees and panelists to guide the question formation. Our representative this year was Sebastian Rowe, who you can see there. And a question of ours did get selected to be asked, which is great. This question was, geothermal heat has the potential to offer sustainable heating and cooling for households reliant on carbon-intensive gas heating and provide reliable domestic supply. The absence of clarity surrounding ownership and rights to subsurface heat has the potential to discourage research and development. What could the government do to minimise this barrier to sustainable and reliable heating for homes throughout the UK? So I was really pleased that this question was asked because of my own experience and Megan's experience attending conferences on subsurface heat and subsurface use in general. Issues of rights and ownership comes up all the time as topics of discussion and as a challenge to sort of development in this area. So being able to raise it amongst parliamentarians raises its profile as an issue and emphasises the importance of geoscience in society and also sort of the necessity of its inclusion and consideration in policy. So in responding to the question asked by Sebastian, Philip Dunn MP commented on the growing volume of evidence in support of the potential of geothermal heat across the UK. He acknowledged challenges with high initial costs, but noted the increasing frequency of discussion within government supportive of greater funding to further research and development in this area. So in response to the question's comment on the lack of subsurface frameworks to do with ownership and rights, Philip didn't think that the issue lay in policy, but the issue lay in the technical difficulty of extracting heat over other sources of energy. We as sort of a policy team have been advised that the issue does lie in policy. So this really highlights sort of an area for further work for us that we can sort of do within Parliament. And having sort of the society represented in this way in front of the Environmental Audit Committee really sets a precedent for our involvement and engagement with them in the future on geothermal. So it's also important to note that often the selection of questions at Voice of the Future hints at upcoming or emerging policy priorities, which is another reason why it's really important for us to be there. So in this case, a recently launched foresight project by the Government Office for Science on current and future uses of the subsurface, including geothermal energy, was in the process of development and scoping at the time our question was selected. Sebastian also provided his own reflections on the event, which included, to quote, "What I appreciated most about the event was the opportunity to ask questions directly to MPs. This was a rare chance to engage with elected officials and get their take on the issues that matter most to early career researchers today, such as nuclear energy, COVID-19, GM crops, gender disparities in maths, renewable energy, and much more. A huge thank you to the Geological Society for the opportunity and for the organisers for providing a platform for young people to have their voices heard." So Voice of the Future provides an excellent role-playing opportunity for early career researchers and allows them to experience what the process of evidence collection and parliamentary processes look like. Taking on the role of other in a policy context helps to build empathy as well as sort of knowledge of the working process and an understanding of the constraints of the policy-making system. A key element of successfully engaging with policymakers is also to understand your and their policy position and how this impacts your sort of pre-existing biases and framing that can affect conversation between those providing evidence and those receiving it. Working on closing this gap between evidence and policy making through Voice of the Future demonstrates just one way we as a society are promoting the role of geology in society and raising awareness of geoscience considerations in UK policy making. So I'm now going to move on to another area of our policy work, which is our work to strengthen links between geosciences and policymakers across the devolved nations. So each of the devolved nations host their own version of a science policy day each year. And since I started in October of last year, I've attended Science in the Parliament in Holyrood, Science in the Senedd in Cardiff, and we attended Science in the Stormont in Belfast last month. So these are designed to foster close relations between policymakers and key stakeholders. And Science in the Parliament is organised by the Royal Society of Chemistry on behalf of the Scottish engineering and science community. The event focused on the topic of innovation and featured an exhibition space with sort of stalls from other professional and scientific bodies. It was really useful for me to meet other people in similar policy roles at other sort of scientific organisations at this time, because it was quite early on in my career, and you can talk to them about how they approach policy in their organisation and the policy sort of challenges that they have. And that was a really useful learning opportunity for me. It also always highlights points for collaboration and overlap. So since Science in the Parliament in Holyrood, we've sort of strengthened links with the Scottish Geology Trust, and now are sort of regularly in contact and sharing ideas and supporting each other on things like social media. So there are also presentations throughout the day by speakers such as Professor Julie Fitzpatrick, who's the Chief Scientific Advisor for Scotland, and a variety of MSPs across different Scottish political parties. So this always includes the opportunity for the audience to ask panellists questions. And at Science in the Parliament, these questions surrounded the future of STEM alongside skills in the workforce. So again, another really important reason why we should be there to sort of absorb these sort of current issues. Similarly, in June, me and Megan visited the Senedd in Cardiff, and this time we had our own stall, which you can see me on there. And we sort of discussed our policy work on geothermal, hydrogen, decarbonisation and COP. So this event follows the same principle. So it's organised by the Royal Society of Chemistry, but on behalf of the Welsh scientific and engineering community. We had some really great interactions here, specifically with Science Policy Officer for the Welsh Government, who we sort of chatted to at length about critical minerals. And we also attended a presentation by the Welsh Government's Chief Scientific Advisor. So this again was really interesting. It's sort of similar and the same policy staff from sort of different scientific bodies attend the same events throughout the year. So it's really nice to develop those relationships further. So for example, at the Senedd, we were chatting to the Institute of Physics Wales, who then followed up to ask us for about 100 hard copies of our policy briefing notes and other educational resources to share with Welsh teachers and to put up in Welsh classrooms. So importantly, these events provide a vital opportunity to hear from the geoscience community and the scientific community in general about current and upcoming policy topics, and allows us to identify areas of interest and overlap for collaboration. As demonstrated by the interaction with the Institute of Physics Wales, it's also an important demonstration of our support for the devolved nations. And a sometimes needed reminder that as a society, we do not function to solely support local London organisations. And having materials such as our Geoscience for the Future poster translated into Welsh is a really important part of this as well. A key element of our policy work is to strengthen connections across science policy community. And this is always bolstered by our attendance at these events throughout the year. As I said, they also, help us to discover shared policy and education and outreach themes. Last month, we also visited Science in the Stormont event in Northern Ireland, and it was really interesting to see firsthand how processes and dynamics differ between parliaments, and to hear that the challenges they're facing and the policy topics that they're interested in. So, for example, in Northern Ireland, the topic of discussion throughout the day was the lack of focus on science in the curriculum. And this then led to panelists sharing their perspectives on the future of science education in Northern Ireland, and paved the way for us to talk about our Geoscience for the Future poster on our stall as well. Due to the launch of a new geothermal energy centre on the day just outside the building as well, there was lots of discussion surrounding the geothermal policy landscape in Northern Ireland on the day, which is obviously always useful for us to familiarise ourselves with as well. Again, our presence during these discussions sets a precedent for our involvement and engagement with them on geothermal in Northern Ireland in the future. So Voice of the Future and our work across the devolved nations are just two examples of how we engage with policy as a society. They're part of a portfolio of work that we do to link up individuals with policy opportunities and to maintain and expand our network of valued relationships with researchers and policymakers and everyone in between. So that's my two examples, and I'll pass back to Megan.
Much richer than my examples. As Katie said, that's just a few of the examples of the way that we do this very broad portfolio of work, all with a view to connecting people to opportunities and making sure that we are aware of opportunities that might be beneficial to the community and the wider geoscience policy kind of interface. But obviously, it's not just Katie and I that do this work. We do this work in collaboration with these are just some of the people and organizations that we work with to conduct our science policy work. A couple of examples that I'll just pull out quickly is that we're working currently with the British Society of Soil Science, which is really hard to say, or the BSSS, on developing webinars around themes that are going to come up at this year's COP and exploring the interlinks between the surface and the subsurface from a climate policy perspective. We're also working with the European Geoscience Union on a programme of activity for the EGU's annual meeting in Vienna, annual general meeting in Vienna, next spring, which will support European scientists and researchers attending the EGU with training and personal development in the science policy space. So we are the UK representative in that group, and there's lots of different European partners that contribute to that training too. So in case you weren't already convinced, I wanted to highlight 4 reasons why I think it's really valuable that everybody engage in science policy, something that isn't traditionally rewarded or necessarily kind of supported in different career paths if you don't work specifically in science policy space. Working in science policy gives you the ability to give back. As I mentioned at the very beginning, one of the reasons I ended up in science policy was that I just liked the societal relevance of some of these parts of geoscience as a topic, and everybody benefits when policies are better informed by sort of core science principles. It's good for your career, probably goes without saying, but policy relevant science has tangible impacts, and everybody loves an impact. Being able to raise your profile and connect yourselves with others in your field that have similar passions can be, you know, a real driver for career kind of progression. And research that supports and informs policy attracts more funding and is of greater general interest to those it affects. The third is context. So understanding how your work and the work that you do places you in a societal context can be incredibly rewarding, but also build a personal awareness that can bring a different way to the way that you conduct research or work in industry. or just take up space in the world, which I think is a good thing. And then the fourth is connections. In case we haven't already made abundantly clear, this work does not happen alone. It's fundamental to do this as part of a team. And being active in science policy can connect you with a more diverse set of stakeholders and those interested in your work than if you're just working with others in your field. It can open doors to new opportunities and really build a rich and diverse professional network that can be of benefit to you all. So I guess a small call to action for those that are still with us is to sign up to our database of expertise. Our database of expertise is the way that we at the Society manage our fellows and members and anybody who wants to engage with science policies expertise. So you can sign up using the flyers outside or at the link online. And you can elect to be interested or note your own expertise in certain different policy topics. And we use this database to seek support when an opportunity comes our way, where we don't have an established advisory group or working group or forum on. We don't have an independent advisory panel, for example. So a recent example of where the database has been useful is calls for evidence have come in from government departments that we have not been able to respond to as a society, but we would share those calls with the database according to people's expertise or interests and invite them to respond individually so that views are still represented from the community. So that's just one thing that you might hear about if you sign up to our database. And with that, that's the end of our introduction to science policy at the Geological Society.